Hi guys, so glutes or lack of glute control and back pain is a very common issue for a lot of people with lower back issues. It's very hard for them to actually use the glutes, or the glutes themselves can be very sort of stiff and kind of tight and generally quite aggravated, possibly achy for some people as well. So why is that? So if you're familiar with the work of Professor Stuart McGill, he's done a few studies using EMG testing, and so there's another guy called Brett Contreras. I'm hoping I say his last name correctly, but it's very common to have kind of impairment in the glutes. McGill calls it gluteal amnesia. So why is that? Potentially because we just spend too much time sitting, and generally when you sit for long periods, your glutes are just kind of not doing a lot, and a lot of people tend to sort of compensate by kind of holding their posture together by using their hip flexors, like I am here. I can feel it's a little bit goofy, but also it becomes a hardware and a software problem. So the software problem is it's hard to control your glutes because you just generally don't use them enough anyway. So you have to sort of relearn to use them. But like if learned to ride a push bike slightly incorrectly, you have to kind of relearn how to use your glutes so you can start to use your hips properly. And also there's a hardware issue in terms of things may have adjusted or compensated, particularly around the front of the hips, to kind of put your pelvis maybe in a little bit of a position where it's harder to actually get your glutes to fire. So you may need to do some work to kind of release some tight spots before you do the glute work. But again, it comes from being in this sort of position here. We kind of sat for hours and hours at end. It tends to make the stuff at the front of the hips stiff and tight, particularly sort of hip flexors, quads. TFL is a common one people get problems with, and obviously your glutes are kind of stuck in a sort of weakened position, not really doing much. And then also because you're in this sort of position here, trying to extend your hips and stand up straight because you're not used to doing it, you end up sort of trying to compensate because the glutes are weak and overusing the lower back. So again, this is very common, particularly people who've got sort of bulges and herniations, L4, L5, S1. I can always guarantee you every single time they're going to have significant problems with at least one, if not both of their glutes, and they definitely have an issue with sort of hip extension, trying to get their hips forward without trying to cheat by kind of using the lower back too much to kind of compensate. And you can also guarantee that they'll lose the function to use the hips in useful movements, like a hip hinge, like a deadlift, like picking something off of the floor, and definitely for things like squats. So being able to sit down into and out of a chair without kind of catching your back. If that tends to happen to you, there's a very good chance that you're not very good control over your glutes. You're trying to overcompensate by using your back too much to kind of get you out the sort of the spots where you're a bit weak, and that's why it tends to catch. So also back to the work with McGill. So one of the things that he's done as well when we talk about glute amnesia is he's done some studies where they hook people up to an EMG machine to measure the muscular activity in the glutes. They tested people to get a baseline, and then they would put them into their aggravating position, which would be sort of compressed flexion, which is obviously sitting like I am now to get the compression, and then kind of rounding forward with your posture, so that lower back, instead of having a nice sort of natural dip, you start to kind of flex it forward. They spend some time there, and then they found that when they re-measured them, using EMG testing afterwards, they actually found it physically harder to get the same amount of signal to the muscles. So it actually had, mechanically impaired the control of the glutes by being in that flex position. So again, that's a common thing. If you're someone who's flexion intolerant, probably 99% of the time, you're going to have a problem trying to use your glutes. So one of your goals needs to be not just stability in the lower back, but also control and stability of the hips by getting the glutes back up to scratch so they can do more work, and then learning to use the glutes when you move your hips. So maybe having to relearn how you squat and do hip hinges and deadlifts to kind of put it all together. So what I'll do today is I'll look at some common kind of glute exercises in sort of a progression in theory from kind of easiest to hardest. But again, for each person it's going to depend, but on paper, this would be sort of easiest to hardest and some sort of recommendations that you can try. And look at sort of the different techniques and kind of the sort of the trade-offs between the different techniques as well, because there's always trade-offs, and all we can do really is find the best tool and then modify that tool to suit you as best as we can. But yeah, definitely I would say, if you've got lower back issues, looking at your glute strength and control is going to be, and working on it is going to be a massive massive benefit to you, particularly if you tend to have very sort of tight, stiff muscles. That's usually a sign that other areas are compensating for the glutes. So getting the glutes up to scratch is going to help you massively. So let's have a look at some different exercises and kind of see what the options are. The place for people to start, and probably the most common glute exercise that people see to kind of, build glute strength, control and awareness, what we call like a clamshell. So we think about the important things the glutes need to do. Obviously there's hip extension, which would be, like a glute bridge, top of a squat, top of a deadlift, kettlebell swing, those sort of big movements. Getting down to and in and out of a chair as well is kind of important. The other thing they need to do as well in terms of helping make the leg stable around the hip joint is what we call hip abduction. So that's pulling the legs apart, but also there's a bit of external rotation as well through the femur. So that's why, you might have seen people get recommended, or you might have been recommended a clamshell exercise. And the traditional way of doing it is sort of like this, legs at sort of 45 on your side, and then just doing this, which isn't too bad. It's kind of got the good intentions behind it. But what I find for a lot of people who've got back issues, especially if it's been chronic, they've generally got one hip tighter than the other. You're going to find on the side that they're tight, like for me particularly, I'm always tight on my left. If I do this after I've been sat for a while, instead of it, I find it hard to get it into the glute, and all I can feel is it going straight into my TFL, into one of the muscles in the front of my hip, which is kind of defeating, the purpose of the exercise, and kind of making my hip a bit tighter. But having said that, for some people, this is the easiest version to start with. So again, in theory, I'm going to go easiest to hardest, but we have to work out for you which is the best version for you, because our goal is to feel the glute, particularly the glute medius on this exercise in here, actually doing something and eventually start to get it to burn. And that's what we're trying to do. So we have to use whatever variation works best for you. So again, most people will start with this. Again, I'm not a massive fan of it unless we really struggle with the other variations, because again, it tends to sort of sink into the TFL a bit too much. So one variation we can use comes from the wise and powerful Dr. Andrew Locke. We call it a lock style clamshell. So what we do, we'll extend the bottom leg, and we're going to make sure the body and leg is in a nice straight line. And then we're going to take this leg here, rather than being up here, we're going to hook it down below, sort of behind the bottom of your calf, sort of behind your ankle. And now this is the important bit. We're going to rotate the top shoulder and hip together, so they should be at the same angle, towards the floor here, so that your knee, on the leg you're going to work, can touch the floor. And we use this hand for a bit of support, so that if I lifted that knee and took that hand away, you'd see I'd fall to the floor. So roughly, if you think about it, if this is me 90 degrees perpendicular to the floor, this is me being completely parallel to the floor, I'm at sort of 45 degrees-ish, sort of off on an angle. But I want to try and keep my shoulders and my hips at the same angle. I don't want them to be at different angles, so I'm all kind of twisted up. So for some people it might mean you're on your hand. For some people it might mean you're kind of on your elbow. It just depends on obviously the length of your humerus and your arms and how wide your shoulders and your pelvis are. But you find out what works best for you. So we're going to try and get the bottom foot straight. Top leg here again, we're going to hook in, sort of behind the bottom of my ankle. And then from here, what we're going to do, obviously keep yourself steady, we're trying to initiate that movement through the hip joint here by using that glute. So it's a very tidy move. So if you look, really nothing else moves. The one thing we definitely want to avoid is that if you're a bit weak and a bit stiff and it's a bit hard to do, and you're thinking about just getting the leg off the floor, what you'll do to compensate is you'll sort of lift, you'll get to a weak spot, and then you'll twist your hip behind you to make up the difference, then come back down again. So you'll sort of be doing this kind of, there's like movement in the hip. See how my hip is breaking away from where my shoulder is? Which is also defeating the object of the exercise, but also it's going to ingrain other problems as well, and potentially could be an aggravator for your back if your back doesn't like twisting forces. So we're going to make sure the hip stays in line with the shoulder, doesn't move. We're just moving that knee off the floor. So when you first start, you might need to just be in this position, just see if you can start to tense that glute. So I'm trying to tense in here, and then tense it so hard that you just about get the leg to move off the floor and then back down again. So tense so hard, just about to get to move. And it might be a tiny movement, but if a tiny, clear, clean movement is way better than the big, sloppy one. And then over time, as you get used to it, you've got more control. You better get a little bit further and further and get higher and higher up. So the general rule is the more sort of, the angle that you're kind of back here, the easier it is, and also more likely if your legs are tucked up, TFL will kick in. But also, conversely to that, if we're here, if we want to make the exercise even harder without adding any bands or extra resistance, if we just tilt more towards the floor as we get better at it, until we're almost on the front, and we can do a version like this, that's even harder again. That really is going to challenge that glute medius in its end range here and make it a lot harder. But again, that's one way you can potentially up the challenge if you need to from the standard version. The other way, obviously, we can use a band like this, like sort of a therapy band. So you use like a pre-cut one like this, or we can get one of the ones that's kind of, just a long length, and you can just sort of loop it to suit the length that you need. If I hook it on, so for this one I tend to hook it on above the knees, but again it depends on the band. And then from here, same position. So now there's a little bit of extra resistance because the band's trying to pull my leg back down to the floor, so I can kind of work against that. And that will start to give me a nice burn. So again, it's thing like lifting the knee, a little bit of external rotation should be coming through the joint. The joint should be moving nice and free, and the freer it does, the easier it is to get the glute to burn. The easier it is to get the glute to burn, the easier that movement's going to be as well. And it's one of those exercises that you're just going to have to, it's like a bit of a volume war. You have to do lots of sort of reps every single day to kind of get that joint to kind of, I guess, like unrust, I would call it. So we start to get control of those glutes. So, I might start people off with sort of, 3 to 4 sets of 15 to 25 reps. Once they've got that, I'll start to migrate them towards, a single set of 50 to 100 reps on each side. It sounds a lot, but once you're good at it, you can get that done pretty quickly. If you just even this sort of kind of relaxed pace with a band on, it's pretty easy to get 100 out as part of a warm-up, say, before, a workout. Which you may have to do going forward, is you may always have to do a bit of glute activation work before you do, workouts in the gym or, on the field playing sport, whatever it may be. So Dr. Lock Clams is my preferred way of doing it, and then my preferred way to progress it really is to add the band for a bit of extra resistance. So that looks at, hip abduction and external rotation. So now let's look at the next function we need to look at, which is hip extension, which again, if you've got back issues, is going to be a major issue for you. So let's look at how we can sort of build our way through that. Next thing we need to look at, and again, it's, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to see some of the back issues is they've got, next to zero glute control over, or using the glutes for hip extension. And again, what you're going to do to compensate is try and sort of crank for your lower back to make up for that, which is not a good thing to be happening. So again, another one I've got from Dr. Andrew Locke. So this is prone hip extensions. So what we want to do is be on a nice sort of comfortable floor or mat, so we can sort of rest either on our chin, or we can get a pillow. We'll use our arm for our forehead, a couple of options, or you can sit yourself on your chin like this if you need to. But what we need to do, particularly on the side that we're working, is have our hand on the front of our hip, on the front of our pelvis, so that we can sort of drive in and hold ourselves accountable, so that we can actually use the glute. If we don't, and we see, the pelvis starts to peel off the floor, you actually start sort of cranking through your lower back, which is the opposite of what we want. So we use the hand as a bit of a tool and a bit of a gauge. So you're going to have both hands here. My preference is to sort of sit my chin like this, and then have the my pelvis on my hands. I'm trying to drive into the hand into the floor, keep that pressure there. And again, I think a nice slow methodical thing like squeezing the glute first, and then squeeze through to come up. Now the theory is with having the leg bent roughly at 45 degrees here, is it should make it less likely you'll try and cheat by using your hamstrings. But again, play around with it, see what works best for you. So for me, I think I'm pulling my toes up towards my shin, and drive that pelvis into my hand, keep the pressure there, squeeze the glute, and then squeeze the glute to come up and into position. Again, you could use sort of sets of 12 to 15 on this, move it up to sets of 20 if you needs be. And the goal on this one really is to try and keep it out of the lower back, and try and keep it out of the hamstring. But again, if you want, you can try sort of a long-legged version and try and squeeze through. So for me, when I do that, I find it creeps into the hamstring a little bit too much for my liking. Then just squeeze through, and again, the goal is to feel the glute working and try and get it to burn. And sometimes if you've got very stiff hips, as you start doing this movement and it sort of starts to reset the joint, you might get a little bit of like a popper like that, as it kind of, pulls the hip joint back into kind of, better alignment, because the glute's actually doing its job now. So again, you do both sides, and usually what you find, same on the clamshells actually, is you might find one side's better than the other. And usually if you've got a vague side with the glute, if you tend to have sort of hip problems where the front of one hip feels tight, it's generally the one where the glute's the weakest. So again, if we work on sort of glute strength and control, we're going to get a better result than if we just try to stretch stuff out and continuously chase our tail. So I always say it's better to invest the same amount of time you would doing kind of stretching and releasing tight hips, addressing the actual problem. You get better return on investment, but also long term it's going to actually sort the underlying problem out. So that's hip extension here. Again, very important. Again, this is quite tricky for a lot of people because they'll try and use their back and they'll try and use their hamstrings to do the movement. So it's hard to get it kind of tight for a lot of people. And again, as you get better, the movement can get a little bit higher. But again, the main goal is to feel that glute in control of that movement and not let it creep out into other areas that we don't want to do that work. So we can look at, start with maybe clamshells. Once you've got kind of them down pat, obviously keep them in for sort of maintenance and control, then sort of add in the prone hip extensions here, and then we'll look at the next exercise, which a lot of people have seen, which is Glute Bridge. For my money, I think if you can get a good ground in clamshells and hip extensions first, and then move to a glute bridge, you'll find them a lot more productive and easier to learn. So we'll look at those next. So glute bridges. Sometimes people get sort of prescribed these straight off the bat, which can work for some people. I find for a lot of people who've got ongoing back issues and tight hips, it's probably a little bit too advanced straight off the gate from sort of start with. But we're going to be on my back. So what I do for a rough gauge for where my feet should be, if I put my hands down to my side, I should just be able to touch my heels with my finger, like that. But you can sort of make little adjustments from there. And then you want to sort of play around with width. I find for a lot of people being slightly wider than you think, so probably more like shoulder width with your toes turned out is probably the best for a lot of people. But again, you play around with it, see what works best for you. So that's kind of our sort of a base bottom position, but now we need to set the movement up to get it correct. So what I like to do, if you're familiar with the McGill curl, is I like to set a little bit of McGill curl brace, maybe like a 2 or 3 out of 10, just to kind of protect the lower back. So what we're doing here, what we do not want to do, and this is non-negotiable, is that in this position here on the floor, my back leg has sort of a natural slight arch to it, so it's slightly off the floor. What I don't want to do is sacrifice that by initiating this movement by trying to peel off the floor, by flattening my back into the floor to try and come up. So if you're someone who's got disc bulges and herniations, we know you have flexion intolerance, so there is zero excuse for putting you into flexion during an exercise, because that's going to make your disc damage way worse. And also what we're going to do, if you think about it long term, is we want to encourage you to use your hips and your glutes in a way that spares the back, not that we start to ingrain that you put your back in a dangerous position just for to squeeze your glutes, because that's just pointless. It just throws the risk through the roof for next to no reward. So we want to minimize risk, maximize reward. So we're going to learn how to control that spine by using the brace in its safest neutral position, or in that neutral range, and then learn to use the glutes in a way it doesn't disturb or disrupt that. So again, we have a little bit of brace. Again, there's a very slight natural arch in my lower back, hands out to the side for a bit of support. So again, what I want to do, again, which I think is important for a lot of people when they start with glute work, I'm just trying to throw my hips up to the sky and hope for the best, because pretty much guarantee your hamstrings, your back will be doing the work, is in this position here. I'm just going to start by just sort of working out if I can tense the glutes. And again, they might feel a bit vague, but if I can get a little bit of tension on first, squeeze through that tension in the control, and as I go up, it gets a little bit easier to kind of squeeze them. So I'm just going to keep squeezing all the way up until I think I'm at my maximum range. And I'm going to hold for a 10-second hold. And then I'm just going to come down under control, let them relax a little bit, re-engage a little brace, squeeze the glute, and squeeze through slowly, making sure both sides are working as well. Again, you might have one side's a bit more vague. But what I'm trying to do as well, as I come up, which helps, is just to push my knees out a little bit, just as I come up. And again, that should just help get a bit of extra squeeze at the glute. And then I go as high as I can without losing that tension in the glutes. Again, if you've got a problem with extension and you go too high, you'll probably start to crank on your lower back to get that extra difference. What we want to do is use the glutes all the way through. And as they get stronger over time, you will use them more to get higher and higher without it kind of leaking out into areas we don't want to overuse. But again, the main goal is to feel the glutes are working. So you should start to burn. If you're doing these well, even after a couple reps, they'll start to burn like that. So again, what can help some people, if they struggle to feel the glutes, is we can add a little bit of extra challenge by putting a band on. So again, depending on your band, it either wants to be sort of below your knee or just above. This one I think tends to work for me best because of the position. So have it just below, but you find out what works best for you. So again, I'm going to set my feet up, a little bit of brace, squeeze the glute, and I slowly squeeze through. And my goal now is to pull the band apart a little bit and keep that tension on the whole time. And now that just accentuates a bit more of the work the glutes got to do and can be a little bit easier to get focused on them. And down, so nice and smooth. Again, a little brace, squeeze, and squeeze through like that. So again, what I would do is, it was a rough overview, doesn't have to be done for everyone, is I'd probably work on clamshells first of all, and your goal is to get to sort of single sets of 100 with good control, particularly if you can do it with a band, even better. Then look at hip extension and look at sort of being able to do sets of up to sort of 20 reps or so, good clean reps with no hamstring or lower back involvement. And then when we get to sort of glute bridges, I tend to get the reps sort of 8 to 10 because I've got that slow squeeze up and that 10-second hold. Otherwise you'll be there all day trying to do them. And again, a band can be helpful just to sort of wrap around the legs. You can also, if you want to, kind of challenge it a bit more, you can add like a little dumbbell or something and come up slowly. But the goal is with those, for most people I find they throw the hips up way too quick. The hamstrings and lower back are just doing all that extension. And what we want to do is if you come up a bit slower, it's a bit easier to kind of get into the glutes and make sure they're doing the job that they should be doing. So there you go, bit of a brief overlook, but if you've got lower back issues, working on your glutes really does pay dividends. And what I generally find is people with back issues, particularly if they've got sort of lumbar disc issues, is they fall into one or two camps. Some people need to work on stability around the spine before we look at the hips and glutes. So that's doing things like McGill curls, side bridges and bird dogs first, and then we sort of work our way down. Other people, we have to sort of do some work on the glutes first and then work our way back up to doing things like the side bridges and bird dogs. So again, it's one of those ones you're not going to know until you start doing things and then working out what works best for that person and what works best for you. That's just a rough overview. But either way, at some point, we're going to have to do some glute work, glute control work, and get these glutes nice and strong. And then from there, what you would do once you've got that kind of component, and along with the stabilizing components around the core, the McGill work, is then we need to put all those elements together, a bit like an orchestra, and put them into a bigger movement like a squat or a hip hinge or a deadlift. So you learn to use them all at the same time, and they're all doing the fair share of work, and you're grooving the correct movement patterns. So that's kind of an important thing with back issues is not just do the rehab and then try and jump back into what you were doing before. You'll methodically progress your way back to it by building layers on top of each other. So components first, like the glutes for in this example, then put those components into doing things that are more useful for what you want to do in terms of your goals, whether that's lifting weight or getting back to sport or just day-to-day movements. So quick look at glutes, give them a try, but remember the most important thing is you feel the glutes working, try and get them to burn. The more you can make them work and burn, the more benefit you'll get. And again, this sort of stuff can be done daily and should be done daily. So you learn that sort of control and you get that connection to your glutes again.